Hey everyone. Recently, someone on Twitter pointed me in the direction of the YouTube channel Stopping Socialism TV, and frankly, I've been having trouble sleeping ever since. I mean, what if they really do stop socialism? That's the thing I like. Oh no! They even have a video called The 3 Best Arguments Against Socialism. The description of it reads, "You'll never lose another argument with a socialist with these 3 great arguments against socialism and communism." I don't even know if I can bear to watch this. Is the communist movement really over? Will they really never lose a debate again? Okay, I've decided to watch the video.
Hi, Justin Haskins here for another Stopping Socialism video. Today's topic is 3 great arguments against socialism. Now, I'm just going to preface all of this by saying that if you're really interested in making great arguments against socialism, you have to know your audience. It all depends on who you're talking to. These arguments are arguments that I've used in the past against people who call themselves socialists but aren't necessarily really into the literature. They're not always Marxist socialists. A lot of times these are just sort of your run-of-the-mill Bernie Sanders supporters, people like that, people who don't necessarily understand the history. They're not members of the Democratic Socialists of America or anything along those lines. If you're dealing with someone who's a really hardcore Marxist, then these arguments probably aren't going to work. They've heard them before. But for most of the people in your life who call themselves a socialist, this will work pretty well.
This might be the quickest retreat I have ever seen. Everything about the video from the outside looking in screams, "Ah! These arguments will make socialists die of too much logic poisoning!" And then you click on it and the first thing he says is, "Well, actually these arguments against socialism only work if the person doesn't know what socialism is or doesn't know how to read." And before you ask, it isn't because this guy doesn't understand socialism enough to argue against it. He certainly has a better definition than most conservatives.
And essentially what communism is an ideology that believes that all ownership, all property in society should be collectively owned and managed.
And yet, his 3 epic arguments to destroy socialism only work if they're being used against somebody who doesn't know anything about the topic. He couldn't come up with any that an actual socialist would have trouble with.
So let's just first start off by saying each of these things should be used together. I don't think that you should just take one of these arguments and then have it stand on its own. It should be 3 arguments all together. Now, argument number 1 is this. Socialism has never worked anywhere it has ever been tried, ever. Okay? And that in and of itself should be a pretty powerful argument. All right? Socialism, no matter where it's been tried in many different cultures. It's been tried in Asia and in Europe and in the Americas. It doesn't work regardless of religious beliefs, the time period, the technology, the language, the various cultural aspects to things. It doesn't matter. Wherever socialism has been tried, it has failed. And that's a really important argument to make.
Did anyone need a YouTube video for this? Please tell me, regardless of your political beliefs in the comments, have you heard this argument before? Yes, you have. Even if you say no, I'm disregarding it. You've heard it. I know you have. Everyone and their mother has heard this argument. It's so ingrained in our heads that this guy doesn't even bother to provide any evidence or even a metric with which to measure this failure. And why would he? Without thinking too deeply about it, it's pretty easy to look at this argument and see it as true. I mean, the USA is the richest country in the world, and the USSR was not. Unfortunately, this argument falls apart when you apply just the slightest amount of scrutiny to it. So let's do something wild for a minute and consider context. The context is pretty simple. The successful socialist revolutions of the 20th century exclusively took place in already impoverished countries, most of which being impoverished as a result of colonialism and neocolonialism, whereas the countries they're being compared to are the most powerful countries in history as a result of that very colonialism/neocolonialism. It doesn't matter that the Soviet Union went from the backwater of Europe to a global superpower that rivaled the United States and vastly improved the standard of living of its citizens. It doesn't matter that China did the same. Okay, so that's argument number 1 as to why argument number 1 is bad. Alternatively, you could make the entirely plausible argument that those countries weren't socialist. Socialism is just the abolition of private property and thus class division. A definition so vague is of course going to breed lots of disagreements as to what is and isn't socialism, and that's okay. Furthermore, even more context is missing when you consider the geopolitics of the world these revolutions were happening in. The Russian Revolution had a coalition of capitalist armies invading during their civil war. The same thing happened in Korea and Vietnam and was attempted in Cuba, and those are only the famous ones. The capitalist imperial core will impoverish entire sections of the globe with genocide and colonialism while making themselves superpowers in the process, and then try to invade those countries whenever a socialist, liberatory revolution begins, and then they entirely isolate that country with embargoes, and then, after all that, they have the gall to throw up their nose and say, wow, your country is still only almost as powerful as mine. I guess socialism never works. And finally, I would just like to say that capitalism has failed everywhere it has been tried. Actually, that isn't true. Capitalism works perfectly the way it was designed. For a select few individuals to collect the fruits of the labor of humanity for themselves, growing immensely rich while millions starve every year. To claim that capitalism works while living in the country that is the prime beneficiary of it makes perfect sense. Neocolonialism exploits the entire global south to make a few very rich Americans even more rich. And it also makes products cheap for even the American working class, giving them a higher standard of living. There's another reason why it would work for this guy especially, but I'll get back to that.
167 million people in just the past 100 years alone. 167 million people have been killed, exiled, or imprisoned by socialist and communist parties. So socialism hasn't just failed a little bit, it's failed spectacularly. It has been literally one of the most deadly ideas ever created in the history of human civilization. So socialism has never worked. That's argument number one.
Alright, next we move on to the absurd death toll this person places on socialist countries. Every single person says a different insane number for this, but they usually come from the Black Book of Communism. And even that book only claimed the number to be 100 million. But again, take this number with the largest grain of salt you can possibly find. Many of the contributors to the book disassociated themselves from it after, saying that the main author heavily exaggerated the death tolls because he was, quote, obsessed with coming to the number 100 million, end quote. To do this, the author added many things to the list that make it sound like socialism is some sort of genocidal ideology akin to Nazism. For example, the Nazis are victims of communism, and people dying in famines, even less so than would have happened pre-revolution, those people were violently killed by socialism, and the victims of Pol Pot are totally victims of communism. Bring up that Pol Pot was bad to a communist and watch them crumble into the dirt, screaming, "No! I love Pol Pot! Don't bring up his atrocities! I love Pol Pot! He's definitely a communist!" And if all that wasn't enough, he adds exiled or imprisoned onto the end, so that, there's extra padding there. Okay, so the first unbeatable argument against socialism wasn't very good, but maybe the second one will totally wreck me and make me burn all of my Pol Pot posters.
Now, a really important argument to add to argument number one, it has to come along with it, is that Scandinavian socialist countries, that's how they're often referred to, aren't actually socialist countries. And they're not the utopias that so many other people say that they are. We're talking about Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, countries like that. Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and many other people, they'll look at those countries and they'll say, yeah, these are perfect little socialist utopias. But here's the thing. Go to the Heritage Foundation World Freedom Rankings, look at the Cato Institute, their rankings on economic freedom, and you'll see that when you dig down deep into the policies that exist in these countries, do they have some socialist big welfare programs? Absolutely. They have single-payer healthcare. They have free college tuition in many of these countries. Yes, that's 100% true. But if you're looking at the whole picture, you'll see pretty quickly these are not socialist countries. They have market-based economies. Up until very recently, they had lower corporate tax rates than we have here in the United States.
Alright, and the second argument against socialism is just that socialism and social democracy are different. He said earlier to use these arguments against social democrats, so let me just try to imagine how this conversation would go. I like Bernie Sanders. I think we should have universal healthcare. Oh yeah? Well, socialism has never worked. I mean, look at the People's Republic of China. Pretty crappy country, huh? No, I don't support the People's Republic of China. I just want universal healthcare. Scandinavia isn't socialist. Checkmate, commie. Okay, well, let's just do whatever you call that then. Whatever they do, let's do that. You just got totally owned. Sorry, it isn't your fault. These arguments are unbeatable. Get owned, lib. Anyways, I'm just gonna skip this part. He just says all the ways that social democracy is still capitalist for a minute or two, and I have no objections. It certainly isn't a great sign that one of your unbeatable arguments against socialism isn't objectionable at all to a socialist, but whatever. Let's hear the third and by far most interesting argument, because here's where it gets truly big-brained. Here is where this man will explain how socialism is inherently immoral. I've honestly never been more terrified in my life.
Argument number 3. Even if you could find a socialist country somewhere in the world that is successful, it would be deeply immoral. Now, no socialist society has ever worked, ever. It always inevitably leads to tyranny of some form, often with blood in the streets. But even if you could find a socialist country that would work, it would be a deeply immoral system. And here's why it would be a deeply immoral system. In order to have a socialist society, you need to have collective ownership and management of property. At the very least, you need to have collective management of property. You don't necessarily need to have collective ownership, although that's the traditional understanding of socialism. Now, if you have collective ownership and management of property, then that means that somebody has to actually be making the decisions, right? You either have to have an authoritarian government at the top, which is often what happens in socialist societies, or you need to have democratic system for doing this, either a representative government or a direct democracy that controls the property. Here's the problem. Regardless of whether or not you believe in a democratic socialist society or an authoritarian socialist society, it doesn't really matter how the property is controlled and managed for this particular argument that I'm making here. The point is this. It has to be managed collectively in some way, which means that if you're a minority in that society, if you're in the if you're a moral minority, what I like to call a moral minority, or if you're a religious minority, or whatever it is, if you're in the minority, you're at the mercy of whatever the majority of people in that society decide, or whatever the ruling class in society decides. So if they decide, for example, that we're going to have a socialized healthcare system, and you happen to be a nun, a Roman Catholic nun, or a devout Roman Catholic who believes in the Roman Catholic Church's teachings on sexuality. Now, I'm not a Roman Catholic, okay? But if you are a Roman Catholic, then, and you're a devout Roman Catholic, then you believe that it is a sin, a deep sin, a mortal sin that separates you from God to support or promote or partake in contraception. Okay, sexual contraception. We're talking about birth control pills, condoms, or any form of abortion, anything like that. It's a mortal sin to take part in it. And yet, in a socialist society, in a socialized healthcare system that has birth control, that has condoms, that has abortion, and just about every democratic socialist that I'm aware of in the United States today wants all of those things paid for by the government, you're forcing people who believe that those things are deeply wrong. Again, put aside for a moment whether you think they're deeply wrong. Lots of people believe they're deeply wrong. You're forcing those people in a socialist society to not only live in a society where these things exist, that would be one thing. You're forcing them to actually pay for it and to be a part owner of it and to pay the salaries of doctors who are engaging in these activities. So you can see how this creates all sorts of moral problems. You are forcing people in socialism, and there's really no way around it.
Oh my God. He's right. He's totally right. If we live in a society with collective ownership, a society free from exploitation and the violence of the state and capital, nuns will have to live in a society with birth control. My mistake with my reasoning was forgetting that a nun's right to live in an authoritarian theocracy where nobody can exercise any control over their body trumps my right to have said control. I believe it was John Stuart Mill who said, "Your right to standing in that spot ends when my fist starts to swing over there." Okay, I can't keep up the bit. Does he understand that this argument against economic democracy can be applied to political democracy almost without even changing any of the words? Like, oh sure, you and a majority of other people think birth control should be legal, so everybody can be more free? But you didn't consider the fact that a small minority of people think you shouldn't have those freedoms. If you democratically decided to gain those freedoms, you'd be oppressing those who think you shouldn't have them. Like, I'm sorry, but I just don't care if a nun is upset that birth control exists. I don't care.
And it's not just healthcare issues, it's all sorts of issues. You're forcing people in a socialist society, minorities in that society, to partake and engage in and even become owners of systems that they believe are wrong. Another good example of it that has nothing to do with religion, at least in many cases, is what do you do with people in a socialized agricultural system who believe that it's wrong to kill animals for food, right? For either religious reasons or just personal reasons. They think it's wrong to kill cows for food. They're vegetarians. What do you do with people who belong to PETA, the people for the ethical treatment of animals? What do you do for these people? In a socialized agricultural system, in a society that wants to eat meat, which is basically the vast majority of societies on the face of the planet, if you happen to believe it's immoral and wrong to kill animals, then in a socialized economy, you have to kill those. You have to pay for the killing of those animals and the meat packing plants and the meat distribution facilities and all the rest of it. You see, so you're forcing people to partake and engage in activities that they believe are deeply immoral. And so for that reason, I believe that socialism isn't just wrong. It isn't just destructive. It isn't just bad. It's not just a bad system. Socialism is an evil system. I know that's a really strong word, but if you think about it, it's evil. It's wrong. Isn't it wrong to force people to violate their religious beliefs? Isn't it wrong to force people to kill animals if they think that it's wrong to kill animals? Isn't it wrong to force people to violate their conscience? Of course, in Western civilization, we all agree that those things are wrong, and yet people don't connect socialism with that problem, even though socialism is intricately tied to that problem.
This argument is hurting my brain. It's so stupid. Like, I really wish he would have just sat down for a minute and thought about the implications of this point before he recorded this video. Like, he's arguing that a system where a small minority of people own and control everything and kill animals to advance that control is better for vegans than a democratic system. What do we do with vegans under socialism? The same thing as now, except they would probably have slightly more control. Like, I know this is a crazy shock to vehement capitalist supporters, but not everybody is constantly concerned with advancing the interests of a minority at the expense of the majority. If the nuns don't like birth control, suck it up. If vegetarians think we shouldn't eat meat, they can utilize democratic systems to advance their belief, same as under capitalism, except there isn't a ruling class there to profit from and advance that system they oppose. So that's the end of the video, but I know what you're wondering. What's up with these disingenuous arguments? Why are they so interested in stopping socialism? Do they just hate freedom that much? Maybe. But really the reason is because Stopping Socialism TV is just the YouTube anti-communist propaganda wing of the Heartland Institute, a think tank funded by billionaires with the express purpose of increasing their power. Some examples of how they do this is by denying that cigarettes cause cancer and the existence of climate change. So next time you're watching one of these people debunking socialism, remember that it's not so much a reasonable person leveling unbiased arguments against a political system, but instead the capitalist class explaining why we shouldn't take back all the wealth they stole from us.